August 1944. The Red Army stands at the gates of Warsaw. An uprising breaks out in the city, a desperate attempt by the Poles to liberate their capital themselves. 63 days of hell, heroism, and blood. But help never comes. Soviet tanks stand silently on the other side of the Vistula, watching as the city bleeds to death. What was it? A tragic coincidence and military necessity, or the cold, cynical calculation of Stalin, who allowed Hitler to destroy his political enemies? Today we will examine one of the darkest and most controversial pages of World War II, and try to understand why Stalin refused to save Warsaw. In the summer of 1944, as the rumble of guns and the roar of tank engines approached Warsaw, there was not only a sense of impending liberation in the air, but also a heavy, oppressive tension of political struggle. At stake was not just the capital of Poland, but its entire post-war soul. The fate of the country was not being decided on the battlefields, but in the quiet offices of London and Moscow. And these decisions were completely mutually exclusive. In London, far from their homeland, the Polish government in exile had been operating for several years. It considered itself the only legitimate authority, the guardian of the sovereignty of a nation trampled under the boots of the Wehrmacht. Its armed wing in the occupied territory was the Home Army, or AK, the largest underground movement in Europe, which obeyed orders from London. Their goal was crystal clear: to restore an independent, pre-war Poland within its former borders. For them, the Soviet Union was an ally of necessity, but a dangerous and unpredictable ally. The memory of the partition of Poland in 1939 between Germany and the USSR under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was still too fresh. The disclosure of information about the Katyn massacre in 1943 finally severed diplomatic relations between the London government and the Kremlin, turning them into hidden, irreconcilable enemies forced to fight a common enemy. On the other side of the political chessboard was Joseph Stalin. For him, Poland was not just a neighboring country, but a corridor through which war had come to Russian soil twice in 30 years. He was obsessed with the idea of creating a buffer zone of friendly, i.e., loyal to Moscow, states in Eastern Europe. Poland occupied a key position in this regard. Stalin could not and would not accept the prospect of the revival of an independent and, as he was convinced, anti-Soviet state oriented toward the West on his borders. Therefore, in parallel with the advance of the Red Army, he played his own political game. By the summer of 1944, he had created and prepared an alternative center of power, the Polish Committee of National Liberation, or PKNO for short, based in liberated Lublin. This committee, consisting of Polish communists and left-wing figures, was completely controlled by Moscow and positioned itself as the only legitimate government of the new People's Poland. The PKNO also had its own army, the Polish Army, formed on the territory of the USSR under the command of General Berling. Thus, by the time Soviet troops approached the Vistula River, there were two governments and two armies on Polish soil. One was legitimate under international law, but was in exile and had no leverage over Stalin. The other was created and supported by Soviet bayonets, but was ready to build the country according to the Kremlin's blueprint. This split was not just a political dispute, it was a chasm that divided the nation. For the London government and the Home Army, the PKNO were traitors and puppets. For Stalin and the Lublin Committee, the Londoners were reactionaries and accomplices of Western imperialists who dreamed of restoring the old order. In this atmosphere of total mistrust, any military action took on a double political meaning. The liberation of Warsaw was not just a military operation, but a symbolic act that would determine who would be the master of the Polish house for decades to come. The Red Army approaching Warsaw was like a giant steel avalanche, unstoppable and devastating. On June 23, 1944, Operation Bagration began, one of the largest and most successful offensives in the history of World War II. In 5 weeks, Soviet troops inflicted a defeat on the German Army Group Center comparable in scale to the Stalingrad disaster. Dozens of divisions were destroyed, the front collapsed, and rolled back westward for hundreds of kilometers. The pace of this offensive was astonishing. Sometimes Soviet tank corps advanced 50 to 60 kilometers in a day, not giving the enemy time to recover, consolidate their positions on new lines, or organize their defenses. The liberation of Minsk, Vilnius, and Brest. These victories followed one after another, causing euphoria among the troops and in the Supreme Command headquarters. It seemed that nothing could stop this victorious march. By the end of July, the advanced units of the 1st Belarusian Front, under the command of Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, reached the Vistula River in the suburbs of Warsaw. However, behind the impressive successes and bravura reports lay a harsh reality. This avalanche, which swept 600 kilometers from Belarus to the heart of Poland, was at the end of its strength. The armies were exhausted beyond human endurance. Soldiers and officers slept 3 to 4 hours a day, spending weeks in continuous combat. Equipment was worn out. Tanks, self-propelled guns, and trucks required urgent repairs, and many vehicles were lost not so much from enemy fire as from breakdowns and accidents during forced marches. But the most acute problem, the real Achilles heel of the Red Army, was communications. The rear was catastrophically behind. All supply lines were stretched to the limit. The railways, blown up by the Germans during their retreat, had not yet been repaired. The Soviet railway gauge was wider than the European one, and its conversion required time and enormous efforts on the part of sapper battalions. All the supply of ammunition, fuel, food, and reinforcements fell on the shoulders of motor transport, which moved along broken country roads. There was not enough fuel even for tanks, let alone trucks. There was a critical shortage of artillery shells needed to break through the German defenses. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who coordinated the actions of the fronts, later wrote in his memoirs that the troops needed a serious operational pause to bring up the rear, replenish personnel and equipment, and put the units in order. The offensive was running out of steam. Moreover, realizing the threat of a breakthrough to Warsaw, the German command began to rush fresh reserves to the front, including the elite SS tank divisions Viking and Totenkopf. They launched powerful counterattacks against the stretched and weakened Soviet units in the Prague area, on the right bank of the Vistula River, in the suburbs of Warsaw. Fierce and bloody battles ensued. The Second Tank Army, which suffered huge losses, was forced to go on the defensive. Thus, by August 1, 1944, the military situation near Warsaw was paradoxical. On the one hand, the Red Army stood at the very gates of the city, and radio broadcasts called on the people of Warsaw to rise up and fight. On the other hand, it was bloodied, exhausted, and effectively halted by the desperate resistance of the enemy. The Soviet command objectively had no possibility of immediately storming a large, well-fortified city such as Warsaw. This would have required time to regroup, gather strength, and prepare a new, full-scale offensive operation. And it was at this critical moment, the most inopportune for the Red Army, that the uprising began in Warsaw. While Soviet tanks were refueling with the last drops of fuel on the eastern bank of the Vistula, a decision was made in secret apartments in Warsaw that sealed the tragic fate of the city. The Home Army Command, led by General Tadeusz Komorowski, known by the pseudonym Burr, decided to launch the uprising. This decision was not a spontaneous impulse or an act of desperation. It was a key part of a long-planned operation codenamed Burza, Storm. The essence of the plan was simple and daring. As German troops retreated under the blows of the Red Army, Home Army units were to come out of hiding, attack the rear guards of the Wehrmacht, and liberate key Polish cities on their own. The jewel in the crown of this operation was to be Warsaw. The idea was not to wait for Soviet soldiers to liberate the city. The Home Army was to do it itself. The goal was not so much military as political. By capturing the capital and establishing a government controlled by the London government, the Poles would have presented Stalin and the Western Allies with a fait accompli. When the Red Army entered Warsaw, it would not be met by confused residents, but by the acting authorities of the legitimate Polish government, which would have to be reckoned with. It was a desperate political gambit. The AK leadership and the government in exile understood that their chances of retaining power in a post-war Poland controlled by the Soviets were dwindling by the day. The uprising in the capital was their last, and their main trump card in the game against Stalin. They hoped that by demonstrating their strength and will to independence, they would gain the support of Churchill and Roosevelt, who would not allow Poland to be completely Sovietized. The decision on the date of the uprising was made in the last days of July. It was based on several assumptions that, as it turned out later, were tragically mistaken. First, the Home Army Command overestimated the extent of the German army's defeat. They believed that the Germans were in a state of panic, incapable of serious resistance, and would hastily retreat from Warsaw, allowing the city to be captured with relatively few forces. Second, they misinterpreted the appeals broadcast on Moscow radio. Soviet and pro-Soviet Polish radio stations called on the people of Warsaw to take up arms, promising them swift liberation. The AK leadership took this as a signal to act in confirmation that the Red Army was about to launch an assault. They did not understand that these calls were part of a general propaganda campaign and were not coordinated with the actual operational plans of the front. Thirdly, they hoped for massive assistance from the Western Allies, primarily in the form of weapons and ammunition drops, as well as the possible landing of a Polish parachute brigade stationed in Britain. However, an emissary from London who arrived in Warsaw on July 30th brought disappointing news. There would be no significant assistance. Despite this, the decision was made. On July 31st, General Komorowski gave the order to begin the uprising the following day at 5 p.m. This hour was given the code name Hour W. It was a decision made in a vacuum, without any coordination with the Soviet command. The leaders of the uprising deliberately did not contact Marshal Rokossovski. They did not ask for support and did not coordinate their plans. Their action was directed not only against the Germans, but also, in a political sense, against the Soviets. They were entering a deadly game, betting on the heroism of their soldiers and on vague political calculations, without having accurate information about the strength of the enemy or the real capabilities of the Red Army. It was a desperate attempt to wrest history from Stalin's hands, and it turned into the greatest tragedy for Warsaw. At exactly 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944, the sound of gunfire and explosions swept across Warsaw. It was W hour. Thousands of Home Army fighters, many of them teenagers and very young men, emerged from the underground to challenge one of the most powerful armies in the world. Their weapons were extremely scarce. At the start of the uprising, the 50,000 underground fighters had only about 3,500 pistols, less than 2,000 rifles, a few hundred submachine guns, and just a few dozen machine guns. There were almost no heavy weapons, such as anti-tank guns or mortars. The rebels' main weapons were homemade grenades and bottles filled with incendiary mixtures. Their strength lay not in their weapons, but in their courage, their contempt for death, and their thorough knowledge of their native city. In the first hours and days of the uprising, the element of surprise paid off. The rebels managed to capture significant areas in the city center, in the districts of Wola, Stare Miasto, Old Town, and Mokotów. They took control of the post office building, the power station, and several warehouses. Hundreds of white and red Polish flags flew above the rooftops, becoming a symbol of Warsaw's defiance. The city rejoiced. Residents poured into the streets, welcoming their liberators and helping to build barricades from overturned trams, furniture, sandbags, and dismantled cobblestones. The entire city was transformed into a single combat camp. Underground printing presses began printing newspapers, and the rebel radio station Błyskawica, Lightning, began broadcasting. The Delegatura, the underground representative office of the London government, immediately established its authority in the captured territories. It seemed that the daring plan had succeeded. However, although taken by surprise, the German garrison was not broken. The Germans retained control of key strategic objects: bridges across the Vistula, airfields, railway stations, and the government quarter, turning them into impregnable fortresses. They controlled all the main transport arteries, which allowed them to maneuver their forces and cut off the areas captured by the insurgents into isolated pockets of resistance. Communication between these pockets was extremely difficult, and fighters had to move across rooftops and through the city's sewer system. It became clear in the first few days that without heavy weapons, the rebels would not be able to drive the Germans out of their fortified positions. Any attack on German positions turned into a suicidal slaughter. Heroism could not replace anti-tank guns. Moreover, the German command quickly recovered from the initial shock. Hitler, enraged by the news of the uprising, gave orders to suppress it with maximum cruelty and raze Warsaw to the ground. SS-Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, a specialist in fighting partisans, was appointed to command the punitive operation. Additional forces began to converge on the city, including the most notorious punitive units of the Third Reich. The SS Assault Brigade under the command of Dirlewanger, recruited from criminals, and Kaminsky's combined brigade, consisting of collaborators. These units brought with them not just war, but total terror. With their arrival, the battle for Warsaw turned into the systematic extermination of the city and its inhabitants. Hopes for a quick victory faded with every passing hour. The insurgents found themselves locked in isolated areas, fighting an unequal battle against a well-armed and ruthless enemy. While on the other side of the Vistula, the Red Army stood in ringing silence. The news of the start of the uprising in Warsaw reached Stalin in the Kremlin. His reaction was predictably harsh and negative. For the Soviet leader, this action, undertaken without his knowledge or consent, was not a heroic act of struggle for freedom, but a hostile political provocation directed directly against the interests of the Soviet Union. From his point of view, the leaders of the Home Army and the London government were trying to thwart his plans to establish a friendly regime in Poland. They wanted to stab him in the back at the very moment when his armies, bleeding to death, were fighting the heaviest battles on the outskirts of the city. He regarded the entire operation as a reckless and terrible adventure. This phrase from his telegram to Churchill on August 16th became the quintessence of the official Soviet position. Moscow immediately distanced itself from what was happening. The Soviet command declared that it bore no direct or indirect responsibility for the Warsaw action. On August 13th, the Soviet Telegraph Agency, TSS, published an official statement that was reprinted in all Soviet newspapers. It said that the uprising in Warsaw was the work of certain circles in London, that it had not been coordinated with the Soviet military command, and that all responsibility for its consequences lay with emigrant circles in London. This step was of enormous significance. Not only did it absolve the USSR of any moral or military responsibility for the fate of the insurgents, but it also sent a clear signal to the whole world. The Soviet Union did not consider the Home Army to be an Allied force. Moreover, Soviet propaganda began to make extremely harsh accusations against the leaders of the uprising. They were called adventurers and criminals who, in their narrow political interests, were pushing the population of Warsaw to senseless death. It was claimed that they deliberately raised the uprising at the most inopportune moment for the Red Army in order to prevent its advance. In private conversations, Stalin was even more outspoken. On August 9th, he met in Moscow with Stanisław Mikołajczyk, the prime minister of the Polish government in exile, who had flown in on a desperate attempt to negotiate aid. Stalin was cold. He stated that the rebels' cause was unrealistic because the Germans had superior forces near Warsaw and that he simply felt sorry for these Poles. He emphasized that the Red Army would do everything possible to liberate Warsaw, but that this would take time because the enemy had transferred additional divisions to the city. In essence, it was a polite refusal. Stalin could not openly declare that he would not help, as this would have provoked sharp criticism from his allies, Churchill and Roosevelt. But he made it clear that he had no intention of changing his military plans and throwing his exhausted armies into an unprepared assault to save his political opponents. His position was cynical, but from the point of view of his strategic goals, it was perfectly logical. The uprising launched by the Home Army solved several problems for him at once. First, it tied up significant German forces in Warsaw, weakening them on other fronts. Second, and most importantly, it led to the physical destruction of the most combat-ready and patriotic part of Polish society, which was hostile to the USSR. With the help of the Germans, Stalin got rid of the main armed force that could prevent him from establishing his order in Poland. He could simply wait and watch as his enemies, the Germans and anti-Soviet Poles, destroyed each other on the other side of the Vistula. The question of whether the Red Army could have taken Warsaw in August 1944 remains one of the most controversial to this day. Supporters of the betrayal theory argue that military difficulties were only a pretext and that Rokossovsky actually had every opportunity to launch a decisive offensive. However, an impartial analysis of the operational situation at the front paints a much more complex and ambiguous picture. The First Belarusian Front, which made a dizzying 600-kilometer advance as part of Operation Bagration, was stretched to the limit and exhausted by the end of July. This is not a figure of speech, but the harsh military reality. confirmed by archival documents. The rifle divisions that were supposed to storm the city had only 3,000 to 4,000 men left, instead of the standard 10,000 to 11,000. The combat effectiveness of the companies fell to a critical level, with some having only 10 to 15 fighters. There was a catastrophic shortage of ammunition. Due to the lag in the rear, the supply of shells and cartridges barely covered current defensive needs. There was no question of creating reserves for a major offensive operation. The artillery, the god of war, without which it was impossible to break through the Germans' echelon defenses in the city, was silent due to a lack of shells. But the main factor that halted the Soviet advance was the sharp reinforcement of the German forces near Warsaw. Realizing the seriousness of the threat, the German command transferred 5 fresh, fully equipped tank and motorized divisions to this direction in the last days of July and early August. Among them were elite SS units, the 5th Panzer Division Viking, the 3rd Panzer Division Totenkopf, and the 19th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht. It was a formidable force. On August 2nd, these divisions launched a powerful counterattack against the Soviet 2nd Tank Army in the suburbs of Prague. Fierce battles ensued, lasting several days. Cut off from their supply bases, without sufficient fuel and ammunition, and without adequate air cover, the Air Force also lagged behind, unable to relocate to forward airfields. Soviet tankers suffered heavy losses. The 2nd Tank Army was effectively destroyed and lost its striking power. It was withdrawn from the battle and sent for reorganization. Thus, by the time the uprising began, Rokossovsky's strike force, which could have broken through the German defenses, had been knocked out. Soviet troops near Warsaw were forced to go on the defensive, repelling fierce enemy attacks. Under such conditions, an order to immediately storm Warsaw would have been pure suicide. Crossing such a large water barrier as the Vistula under enemy fire, and then storming a huge city turned into a fortress, is one of the most difficult military operations. Without careful preparation, without the accumulation of forces, without air superiority and overwhelming artillery superiority, it was doomed to failure and colossal, unjustified losses. The Soviet plan, approved by the High Command on July 28th, did not involve a frontal assault on Warsaw, but rather a bypass of the city from the north and south, followed by encirclement. But even this plan required time. A new assault plan was only drawn up on August 8th, and it called for the offensive to begin no earlier than August 25th, after reserves had arrived and the rear had been reinforced. The uprising threw a spanner in the works, but it did not overturn the harsh laws of military science. For many Poles, and a significant portion of Western historians, the answer to the question of why Stalin did not help Warsaw lies not in operational reports and data on the availability of ammunition. It lies in the realm of big, cynical politics. According to this version, known as the betrayal theory, the military difficulties of the Red Army were merely a convenient pretext, a smokescreen behind which cold and cruel political calculations were hidden. Stalin did not simply fail to help. He deliberately allowed the Germans to crush the uprising. The goal of this inaction was simple and terrible: to use Hitler to get rid of his main political rivals in the struggle for post-war Poland. The Home Army, which numbered hundreds of thousands of fighters, was the armed wing of the London government. They were patriots ready to fight for an independent Poland, and the vast majority of them were anti-communist and anti-Soviet. They were the only force within the country that could offer real armed resistance to the establishment of a pro-Soviet regime. For Stalin, they were class and political enemies. White Poles, who had to be neutralized. The Warsaw Uprising provided him with a unique, truly diabolical opportunity to do so. By starting the uprising, the Home Army had trapped itself. The insurgents concentrated their best, most combat-ready, and ideologically motivated personnel in Warsaw. And now they were trapped in the city, fighting against the superior forces of the Wehrmacht and the SS. All Stalin had to do was watch from the other side of the Vistula as his enemies destroyed each other. Every day of the uprising, every destroyed house, every killed insurgent weakened the potential resistance to the future Sovietization of Poland. When the Red Army finally entered Warsaw, no one would be able to prevent it from bringing its puppets from the Lublin Committee to power. The arguments in favor of this version are quite compelling. The main one is Stalin's categorical refusal to allow American and British planes, which could deliver weapons and supplies to the insurgents, to land at Soviet airfields after completing their mission. These were the so-called shuttle flights. This was critically important for the Allies. Flying from Britain or Italy to Warsaw and back without refueling was virtually impossible. Stalin's permission could have saved thousands of lives and significantly prolonged the resistance. But he responded with a firm no, saying that he did not want to have anything to do with the Warsaw adventurers. This step cannot be explained by military considerations alone. It was a purely political decision aimed at isolating and stifling the uprising. Further evidence is considered to be the nature of Soviet propaganda at the time, which not only remained silent about the heroism of the insurgents, but openly branded them as criminals and traitors. Instead of supporting the fighting spirit of the city, Moscow did everything it could to discredit it in the eyes of the world. Supporters of this theory also point out that even when the Red Army did take some action in mid-September, beginning to drop supplies and supporting Berling's army's attempt to cross the river, it was too little, too late, more to create the reappearance of assistance in the face of pressure from the Allies than to actually save the uprising. Thus, according to this concept, the tragedy of Warsaw was not the result of a combination of circumstances, but a political operation planned in advance and cold-bloodedly carried out by Stalin to clear the Polish bridgehead for communism. Soviet and later Russian historiography developed a completely opposite view of the events in Warsaw. It completely rejects accusations of political betrayal and explains the Red Army's inaction solely by objective military reasons. According to this version, Stalin and the Soviet command may not have been sympathetic to the Home Army leadership, but their decision not to storm Warsaw in August was dictated not by politics, but by common sense and a desire to avoid colossal losses. The main thesis of this concept is that by the beginning of August 1944, the Red Army was physically incapable of carrying out such a complex operation as crossing the Vistula and storming a large, well-fortified city. Supporters of this version point to the same facts as military analysts, but draw a different conclusion. Not did not want to, but could not. They emphasize the enormous exhaustion of the troops after a 600-kilometer advance. The soldiers were exhausted, the equipment needed repair, and the rear was hopelessly behind. Supplies to the front were disrupted to such an extent that there was a shortage of the most essential items, ammunition and fuel. Under these conditions, launching a new, large-scale operation would have been a military adventure that could have ended in disaster. Particular attention is paid to the German counterattack near Warsaw. The Germans' transfer of fresh SS tank divisions radically changed the balance of power. The Soviet Second Tank Army, which had suffered huge losses, was bled dry. The front's strike force was broken. Marshal Rokossovsky, who commanded the front, pointed out in his reports to the High Command that it was impossible to continue the offensive without an operational pause, regrouping, and reinforcements. Supporters of this version ask a rhetorical question. Would Stalin, known for his pragmatism and toughness in military matters, sacrifice an entire army for dubious political gain? A frontal assault across a wide river against prepared defenses would have led to tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of casualties. Such losses could have slowed down the entire advance on Berlin for a long time. From this point of view, the decision to pause was the only correct one from a military and strategic standpoint. The Soviet command's plan was not a frontal attack, but a flanking maneuver to encircle Warsaw. It was this tactic that made it possible to minimize losses and avoid devastating street fighting. The outbreak of the Uprising disrupted this plan, but did not negate its advisability. The Red Army still needed time to gather strength to carry it out. As for the refusal to provide airfields to the Allies, there is a military explanation for this as well. The Soviet airfields at the front were themselves under constant attack from the Luftwaffe. Accepting large numbers of heavy American bombers would have placed an additional burden on the already overloaded infrastructure and made them easy targets for German aircraft. Thus, within this concept, the tragedy of Warsaw is primarily the result of the adventurism and political short-sightedness of the Home Army leadership itself. They raised an uprising at the most inopportune moment, without coordinating it with the only force that could have provided them with real help. They set the Red Army an impossible task, and all responsibility for the failure and loss of life lies with them, not with Stalin, who acted as a responsible and rational military leader, prioritizing the preservation of his troops and the achievement of the ultimate goal, the defeat of Germany. One of the darkest and most irrefutable episodes in the history of the Warsaw Uprising, which even the most ardent defenders of Stalin's policies find difficult to explain, was the refusal to use Soviet airfields to help the insurgents. This episode clearly demonstrates how cynical politics prevailed over humanism and Allied duty. From the very beginning of the uprising, it was clear that without air support, it was doomed. The insurgents desperately lacked everything: weapons, ammunition, medicine, food. The only way to get help to them was by airdrops. The Polish government in exile immediately appealed to Winston Churchill to organize an air bridge to Warsaw. Churchill, who saw an independent Poland as an important counterweight to Soviet influence in Europe, enthusiastically supported the idea. The British and American air forces were ready to begin the operation. However, an insurmountable technical problem arose. The Allied airfields were located in Great Britain and southern Italy, more than 1,000 kilometers from Warsaw. Heavy bombers, such as the Lancaster or Flying Fortress, could fly to Warsaw, drop their payload, and simply run out of fuel on the return journey. The only solution was so-called shuttle flights. Planes would take off in Italy, drop their payload over Warsaw, and land at Soviet airfields in liberated Ukraine, not far from the front line. There they refuel, take on board new cargo of bombs, and, on the way back, bomb targets in Germany. This scheme had already been successfully used earlier as part of Operation Frenetic. On August 4th, Churchill and Roosevelt sent an official request to Stalin to allow such flights to supply Warsaw. The response from Moscow shocked Western leaders. Stalin replied with a categorical refusal. In his telegrams, he called the uprising an adventure, and its leaders a handful of criminals who had unleashed a massacre in order to seize power. He stated that The Soviet government would not wish to be associated directly or indirectly with the adventure in Warsaw. This refusal effectively meant a death sentence for the insurgents. Churchill was furious. He wrote to Roosevelt that they were facing a grim and sinister decision by the Soviet leadership. He even suggested sending planes to Warsaw without Stalin's permission, saying, "Let's see what he does if they land." But the Americans, unwilling to enter into open conflict with Stalin, rejected the idea. Moscow's arguments that Soviet airfields were overloaded or under threat of German air raids did not stand up to scrutiny. As part of Operation Frenetic, these same airfields were quietly receiving hundreds of American planes. The real reason for the refusal was purely political. By allowing the Allies to supply the home army, Stalin would, first, have strengthened the position of his political enemies. Second, he would have allowed the Americans and British into his sphere of influence, allowing them to make direct contact with the anti-Soviet underground. He could not allow that to happen. By closing the skies over Warsaw to the Allies, Stalin completely isolated the uprising and deprived it of any hope of survival. Despite the ban, pilots from British, Polish, and South African squadrons made desperate suicidal raids from Italy. They flew without fighter cover, at the limit of their range, and suffered huge losses from German anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. But the containers they dropped were a drop in the ocean, and often fell into German hands. This episode of closed skies became one of the most convincing pieces of evidence for supporters of the political betrayal theory. Faced with growing pressure from Churchill and Roosevelt, and realizing that complete inaction could seriously damage his reputation in the eyes of his allies, Stalin finally gave the order to begin providing assistance to the rebels in early September 1944. However, this aid was organized in such a way that its effectiveness was close to zero, which only reinforced suspicions that it was nothing more than a political gesture. On September 10th, almost 40 days after the start of the uprising, Stalin finally authorized a single shuttle raid by American bombers. On September 18th, more than 100 flying fortresses dropped over 1,200 containers of weapons and supplies over the city. But this gesture was cynically belated. By this time, the Germans already controlled more than 80% of the city. The insurgents were trapped on tiny, completely exposed patches of land. As a result, according to various estimates, no more than 15 to 20% of the dropped cargo fell into Polish hands. The rest went to the Germans or was destroyed. This action was a one-off and was never repeated. At the same time, on September 13th, the Soviet Air Force also began night drops. Light Po-2 biplanes, jokingly called corn cobs by the pilots, were used for these operations. These small aircraft could only carry a small load, usually a few bags of crackers and ammunition. They flew at extremely low altitudes, without navigation instruments, using the fires raging in the city as landmarks. The drops were made without parachutes. Bags of food and boxes of ammunition were simply thrown out of the plane. One can imagine what happened to this cargo after falling from a height of several hundred meters. According to the rebels themselves, most of the ammunition was deformed, and the biscuits turned to dust. The Poles joked bitterly that Stalin had sent them flour and nails. In addition, the Soviet pilots did not have accurate maps of the AK units' locations. They did not know which areas were in the hands of the insurgents and which had already been captured by the Germans. Often, cargo was dropped at random and fell into enemy hands. During the uprising, Soviet aircraft made several thousand sorties, delivering, according to official data, a certain amount of weapons, ammunition, and food. However, in the context of a battle involving tens of thousands of people, this aid was a drop in the ocean. It could not radically change the situation. It could only slightly prolong the agony of the fighting city. From the outset, the leaders of the uprising and Western observers regarded this aid as belated and inadequate. It looked like an attempt by Stalin to save face before the world community, to demonstrate his goodwill, while failing to provide the rebels with real, effective support that could have led them to success. Instead of heavy bombers capable of delivering tons of cargo, light aircraft were used. Instead of precise parachute drops, primitive bags were thrown from a height. This aid became another act in the tragic play of Warsaw, where the heroic struggle and sacrifices were overshadowed by the cold political calculations of the great powers. By mid-September 1944, when the agony of the uprising reached its peak, the Soviet command made another attempt to intervene in the course of events. This attempt was linked to the First Army of the Polish Army, a formation created in the USSR from Poles and subordinate to the pro-Soviet Polish Committee of National Liberation. The army was commanded by General Zygmunt Berling. For Stalin, the use of Polish soldiers in the battle for the capital had enormous symbolic significance. It was intended to demonstrate to the whole world that it was the pro-Soviet Poles, not the home army, who were the true liberators of their homeland. On the night of September 16th, after heavy artillery preparation, the advanced battalions of Berling's army began crossing the Vistula in the southern part of the city, in the Cherniakiv district, where the remnants of the insurgents were still holding out. It was a desperate and poorly prepared operation. Soldiers crossed the river in fishing boats, makeshift rafts, and small ferries under heavy fire from German artillery and machine guns. There were not enough crossing points, and coordination with the insurgents on the other side was not well organized. Despite this, the first waves of the landing force, displaying mass heroism, managed to gain a foothold on a narrow strip of land on the western bank. They created several small bridgeheads and engaged in fierce street fighting, trying to break through to the home army fighters. However, from the very beginning, the operation did not go according to plan. The German command, expecting such an attempt, immediately threw large forces, including tanks and assault guns, to destroy the bridgeheads. The paratroopers had neither tanks nor heavy artillery, which could not be transported across the river under fire. All support was provided by artillery fire from the eastern bank, but due to the lack of communication and fire correctors, it was often inaccurate and hit their own troops. The Home Army Command, in turn, failed to provide the paratroopers with adequate support. The Home Army leaders were distrustful of the Berliners, considering them communist puppets. They did not organize a powerful strike from the depths of their positions to meet the paratroopers, which could have alleviated their situation. As a result, Berling's soldiers found themselves trapped on tiny bridgeheads, pressed against the river, and suffering terrible losses. For several days, they fought an unequal battle, bleeding to death in the ruins of Cherniakiv. All attempts to expand the bridgehead and bring in reinforcements failed. By September 23rd, it was clear that the operation had failed. The remnants of the landing force, having lost thousands of men killed and wounded, were either destroyed or evacuated back to the eastern bank. The tragedy of Berling's army became another bloody page in the history of the Warsaw Uprising. On the one hand, it demonstrated the heroism and self-sacrifice of Polish soldiers fighting side by side with the Red Army. On the other hand, it once again raised questions about the motives of the Soviet command. Critics argue that this operation was nothing more than another political demonstration. It was poorly planned, lacked the necessary forces and resources, and was doomed to failure from the outset. In their opinion, Stalin deliberately sent the Berliners to their certain death in order, first, to create the appearance of active assistance, and, second, to weaken these pro-Soviet but still Polish patriotic forces in battle. Thus, even the act of assistance was turned into a tool of cynical politics, where the lives of soldiers were bargaining chips in a big game for the future of Poland. While blood was being shed on the streets of Warsaw, another battle was unfolding in the silence of the Kremlin offices and London residences, a diplomatic battle. The fate of the besieged city became the central theme in the correspondence and personal meetings of the Big Three: Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. And this diplomatic duel clearly showed the depth of the contradictions between the Allies in the anti-Hitler coalition. Winston Churchill took an active pro-Polish stance from the outset. For him, the preservation of an independent, non-communist Poland was a matter of principle and an important element of the post-war balance of power in Europe. He bombarded Stalin and Roosevelt with telegrams, begging, demanding, and persuading them to provide immediate assistance to the insurgents. He called them heroic Poles and emphasized that their struggle was the common cause of all the Allies. In his messages to Stalin, he appealed to the Allies' duty and humanity. His words betrayed his sincere indignation at the inaction of the Red Army. However, all his efforts were met with the icy calm and intransigence of the Soviet leader. Stalin's reaction was consistent and harsh. He denied the very essence of the problem, presenting the insurgents not as allies, but as a handful of criminals acting in the interests of reactionary émigré circles. He systematically misinformed Churchill and Roosevelt about the real military situation, exaggerating the strength of the German defense and downplaying the capabilities of the Red Army. His famous phrase from a conversation with the Polish government in exile's Prime Minister, Mikolajczyk, "I just feel sorry for these Poles," perfectly captures his cynical attitude toward the tragedy. He expressed sympathy, but had no intention of taking any action. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt's position was more cautious and ambivalent. On the one hand, he was under pressure from the powerful Polish diaspora in the U.S. and could not completely ignore the tragedy in Warsaw. On the other hand, his main goal was to preserve the military alliance with Stalin in order to defeat Germany as quickly as possible and, in the long term, to wage war against Japan. He did not want to enter into open conflict with the Soviet dictator over Poland. Therefore, in his correspondence, he was much softer than Churchill. His requests were more restrained, and he more readily accepted Stalin's explanations about military difficulties. This diplomatic standoff came to a head when Stalin met with Mikolajczyk in Moscow in early August. Mikolajczyk flew in, hoping to work out a deal on aid and Poland's future. He left totally crushed. Stalin presented him with a tough choice. Either he and his government would join the pro-Soviet Lublin Committee as junior partners. They were offered only 4 of the 18 portfolios, or they would lose everything. Mikolajczyk understood that Stalin had no intention of negotiating. He had already made up his mind. Poland's fate was sealed, and the Warsaw Uprising was just a tragic backdrop for this decision. The diplomatic battles around Warsaw showed that the alliance between the USSR and the Western democracies was a tactical alliance based on the existence of a common enemy. As soon as the enemy began to weaken, deep ideological and geopolitical contradictions came to the surface. The dispute over Warsaw was not only about saving the city, but also about the contours of the future world. And in this dispute, Stalin's position, backed by the power of the Red Army, proved stronger than Churchill's humanistic appeals and Roosevelt's cautious diplomacy. While politicians in Moscow and London exchanged sharp telegrams, hell was unfolding on the streets of Warsaw. Hitler's reaction to the news of the uprising was immediate and monstrous. He flew into an indescribable rage and gave an order that surpassed in cruelty everything Europe had seen before. The order was simple: suppress the uprising, regardless of the cost in human lives, and raze Warsaw to the ground and turn it into a lake. Every inhabitant of the city, regardless of gender or age, was to be killed. This order was not simply a military directive, but a program of total destruction, genocide. The most notorious and brutal punitive units of the Third Reich became the executors of this monstrous plan. SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, who had extensive experience in conducting anti-partisan operations, which in Nazi language meant mass murder of the civilian population, was appointed responsible for the suppression. Units whose names became synonymous with terror were placed under his command. The main striking force of the punitive forces was the SS Storm Brigade Dirlewanger, commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger, a sadist and war criminal. This unit was formed from convicted poachers, criminals, and concentration camp prisoners. Their combat path was marked by a trail of mass rapes, looting, and murders. Another terrifying force was the combined brigade of the Rona, Russian Liberation People's Army, under the command of Bronislaw Kaminsky, consisting of Russian collaborators. These units brought scorched earth tactics to Warsaw. From the first days of August, they began the systematic extermination of residents in the captured areas. The most terrible symbol of this massacre was the Wola district. In just a few days, from August 5th to 7th, Dirlewanger and Kaminsky's soldiers killed, according to various estimates, between 40,000 and 60,000 civilians: men, women, old people, and children. People were herded into cemeteries, parks, and factory yards and shot with machine guns. The wounded were finished off, and their bodies burned on huge pyres. Hospitals were seized, and patients and medical staff were killed right in the wards and operating rooms. The Germans used heavy artillery, including 600mm Karl mortars, which fired shells weighing 2 tons, turning entire neighborhoods into piles of rubble. The Luftwaffe continuously bombed the city. After clearing the areas, demolition engineers blew up the surviving buildings, carrying out Hitler's order to completely destroy the city. The battle for Warsaw turned from a military clash into the methodical, cold-blooded murder of a city. For the insurgents and civilians, there were no rules of war, no Geneva Convention. Capture meant certain and painful death. This incredible cruelty had a double effect. On the one hand, it only strengthened the desperate resistance of the Poles, who had nothing left to lose. On the other hand, it doomed the uprising to inevitable destruction. It was impossible to resist such a machine of total annihilation without heavy weapons and outside help. Warsaw was bleeding to death, and the world watched this agony with bated breath, unable or unwilling to intervene. By the end of September 1944, the situation of the remaining insurgents and civilians in Warsaw was completely hopeless. 2 months of continuous fighting, hunger, thirst, and terror had exhausted all their strength. The city lay in ruins. The Home Army units were cut off into several isolated pockets of resistance in the city center, and in the Joliborz district. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Often, there were only a few rounds per soldier. There was no food and, worst of all, no drinking water. The sewage system and water supply had been destroyed, and people were suffering from unbearable thirst. Tens of thousands of wounded were dying in basements without medicine or qualified help. All hope of outside help had finally faded. It became clear that the Red Army would not launch an assault in the near future, and Western aid remained symbolic. Continuing the resistance meant only prolonging the agony and increasing the number of casualties among the civilian population, which had already paid a terrible price. In these circumstances, General Tadeusz Komorowski, commander of the Home Army, made the difficult decision to begin negotiations for surrender. On September 27th, the Germans launched a decisive offensive against the last pockets of resistance. Komorowski rejected the idea of a suicidal breakout across the Vistula and made contact with the German commander, Obersturmführer von Dembach. The negotiations were brief. The Germans, interested in ending the fighting as soon as possible in order to free up their divisions for the front, took an unexpected step. They agreed to grant the Home Army soldiers who surrendered the status of combatants, i.e., prisoners of war, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. This saved thousands of lives, as otherwise they would all have been shot on the spot. On October 2nd, 1944, after 63 days of heroic and tragic struggle, the Warsaw Uprising was over. An act of surrender was signed. 17,000 insurgents, including more than 900 officers, emerged from the ruins in organized columns and laid down their arms. They were sent to prisoner-of-war camps. The price of defeat was horrific. In 2 months of fighting, about 16,000 Home Army soldiers were killed. But the most terrible price was paid by the civilian population. According to various estimates, between 150,000 and 200,000 civilians were killed during the uprising. They fell victim to bombing, shelling, mass executions, and disease. After the surrender, the entire surviving civilian population of Warsaw, more than 500,000 people, was expelled from the city. Tens of thousands were sent to forced labor in Germany or to concentration camps. Warsaw was turned into a dead ghost town. But even that was not enough for Hitler. On his personal orders, special SS demolition teams spent the next 3 months, until the arrival of the Red Army in January 1945, systematically and methodically blowing up and burning the surviving buildings. They destroyed palaces, churches, libraries, archives, everything that constituted the historical and cultural memory of the nation. By the time of its liberation, Warsaw was more than 85% destroyed. The uprising ended with the complete defeat of the Home Army and the physical destruction of the Polish capital. Stalin's political goal had been achieved. The main anti-Soviet force within Poland had been decapitated and demoralized. The way was clear for the establishment of a communist regime. So why did Stalin refuse to save Warsaw? Decades after those tragic events, historians still haven't agreed on the answer. As is often the case with complex historical issues, the truth is probably not black and white. It lies somewhere in the middle, in a gray area where cynical political calculations intertwine with harsh military necessity. Today, most independent researchers lean toward the so-called third version, which is a synthesis of 2 opposing concepts. This version acknowledges that the Red Army did indeed face serious objective difficulties in early August 1944. The troops were exhausted, the rear was lagging behind, and the enemy had thrown fresh tank divisions into battle. An immediate assault on Warsaw from the wheels was impossible without careful preparation and threatened to result in huge losses and failure. From this point of view, Marshal Rokossovski's decision to take an operational pause was militarily justified and the only correct one. However, this same version emphasizes that these military difficulties became an extremely convenient and welcome excuse for Stalin. He was given a wonderful opportunity not to do what he did not want to do anyway. Military necessity coincided perfectly with his political goals. He was not eager to save his ideological and political opponents from the home army. On the contrary, their destruction at the hands of the Germans was entirely in line with his plans for the Sovietization of Poland. If communist troops had been fighting in Warsaw instead of the home army, it is safe to assume that Stalin would have found a way to overcome all military difficulties. There would have been shells, fuel, and reserves. But he had no intention of helping the White Poles to establish a regime hostile to him in Warsaw. His actions, or rather, his inaction, were dictated by the iron logic of the struggle for power. Steps such as the categorical ban on shuttle flights by Allied aircraft cannot be explained by military logic alone. It was a purely political act aimed at stifling the uprising. The same was true of the belated and ineffective aid that began in September, which was more like a political demonstration than a real military operation. Thus, the tragedy of Warsaw was the result of a fateful combination of several factors. First, there was the political adventure of the Home Army leadership, which launched the uprising without consulting the USSR, based on incorrect intelligence and naive hopes. Second, there were the objective military difficulties faced by the Red Army on the approaches to the Vistula. And thirdly, most importantly, it was the cold and cynical calculation of Stalin, who used the first two factors to his advantage, coolly sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives in order to establish complete control over post-war Poland. The Warsaw Uprising left a deep scar on the historical memory of the Polish people and poisoned Polish-Russian relations for many decades. It became a tragic symbol of how, in the great geopolitical game, the fate of entire cities and peoples can become a bargaining chip. This is a story of heroism and betrayal, of political ambition and human tragedy, a bitter lesson that remains relevant to this day.